The president sitting down for what appears to be a completely unplanned impromptu interview. No aide present, no lawyer present, nobody on Team Trump present, which is not how presidents usually do any interview. And this was about half an hour of grilling, as we mentioned, by the New York Times. It took place at Trump's golf club in West Palm Beach. And this story, as I mentioned, it crossed the wire around 9 p.m. Joy Reid reporting those key parts. Moments ago, we got this longer transcript coming out from the New York Times, and there is a lot in it. It is quite the interview. More details here on the Russia probe, Trump's views of Attorney General Jeff Sessions, including more criticism of him, his views of Eric Holder, who he says was protecting Barack Obama, his views of Tony Podesta, a Democrat who Mueller has been investigating, and, of course, going back to Hillary Clinton. The first big takeaway, I think, is that you see a legally strategic Donald Trump in this interview. He knows what he's doing, and he strikes a canny balance. He is not in partisan overdrive tonight, attacking Mueller by name like so many Trump allies. Instead, Donald Trump claims he's on some kind of higher ground, and he says, he predicts Bob Mueller will be fair to him. Quote, the Times writing, the president did not demand an end to the Russia investigations here through this new interview, but insisted 16 times there's been no collusion discovered by the inquiry. It makes the country look very bad. It puts the country in a very bad position. So the sooner it's worked out, the better for the country, the president claims. Trump also telling the Times that he is apparently, he says, not bothered by the fact that he has no idea when this Russia probe will be completed. That may be hard to swallow because we know Donald Trump's own lawyers have publicly proclaimed it would be over by Thanksgiving. If you're keeping track, if you have a calendar, you know that holiday came and went and the probe continues. Trump also telling the Times in this new interview tonight, Democrats invented the Russia allegations as a hoax, as a ruse, as an excuse for losing an election. He said, quote, everybody knows his associates didn't collude with the Russians, and insisted that the real stories are about Democrats who worked with the Russians in the 2016 campaign. The president then turned his attention, as I mentioned, to Attorney General Jeff Sessions. This is important when you consider that this is the individual recused from an ongoing probe of potential obstruction, among other things. Donald Trump saying it was, quote, too bad that Sessions recused. And then the Times asked a pretty intelligent question. The reporter asked Donald Trump to compare Jeff Sessions to the previous administration's Attorney General, Eric Holder, under Obama. And Donald Trump said this, I don't want to get into loyalty, but I will tell you that I will say this. Holder protected President Obama, totally protected him. When you look at the things that they did, and Holder protected the president. And I have great respect for that. I'll be honest. I have a little more on that in a moment. Trump also asked here in this very newsy interview whether he would order the Justice Department to reopen the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, something that he has talked publicly about. And he said that he will, quote, stay uninvolved with this particular matter. And then he said something that you could take quite ominously. He told the New York Times tonight, I have the absolute right to do what I want to do with the Justice Department. The fairest way I can tell you what that really means is that claim under our Constitution is not necessarily true. It does depend, of course, on what the president wants to do. Let's get right to it with David Frum, senior editor from The Atlantic, Natasha Bertrand, a political correspondent, Business Insider, who's been following the Russia probe, and Wendy Sherman, a former Undersecretary of State of Political Affairs and a former special advisor to President Clinton on North Korea. David, your view of what is important about this interview and the portrait of the president we see tonight.
Right. President Trump's motives, I've come to understand, can be seen as a triangle with 3 points. Point one is his authoritarianism, and you did a magnificent job of highlighting the quotes that are worrying on that front. The second is his desire to make as much money as he can out of the presidency. And the third, and the one that maybe we've not paid enough attention to, is his psychic neediness. And that was very much on display in this interview. The need to present himself as somebody powerful. People need to come to me. And his responsiveness to flattery and his comments about the president of China. How big a smile is wreathing the face of President Xi tonight as he thinks that little show on the tarmac, what dividends it paid off in manipulating this president's ego?
Ambassador Sherman, you are well positioned to build on the point David makes. And, you know, this is an interview with so much in it. At one point, when asked if he's willing to make deals, he says yes. Then the reporter follows up and says, so you would move to the center on some of these issues? And he says, no, I'm not being centered. I'm just being practical. I don't think I'm changing. And then he says, I'm always moving. I'm moving in both directions, which would seem to be perhaps an inadvertent admission. But again, to David's point on the neediness, he says in this interview, Ambassador, that he knows the tax deal better than the greatest CPA. With regard to Republican congressmen and senators, he says, quote, I love them and they love me.
Yeah, it's quite an interview, as you say, Ari. And building on David's point, the other piece of this is a very transactional approach. And in another article in New York Times tomorrow, an interview with General McMaster, the National Security Advisor, who says he has been taken out of his comfort zone with the Trump foreign policy, but in general, it's all to the good. It is a very transactional foreign policy. He said that he eased up on trade with China because he thought he'd get what he needed on North Korea. He hasn't gotten what he needed on trade. He hasn't gotten what he needed on North Korea. So his transactional approach to things, in that neediness to always be in charge, always talking about the need for bilateral trade agreements, not multilateral trade agreements, even in another article talking about how Angela Merkel said that, yes, he could have a bilateral trade deal with Europe, and his not understanding that Europe is made up of 28, soon to be 27 countries after Brexit, after the UK leaves the European Union. But the entire article is, I think, as you said, part of the pragmatic realism that McMaster also speaks about. That pragmatic realism can head in any direction as the need arises and as it shines a light on the President of the United States.
And Natasha, on the Russia probe, we saw a very canny president, as I mentioned in my introduction to this news. This is a president who tweets a lot of things for reaction. Just today, he was clearly trolling and tweeting silly things about global warming to get outraged responses. That's sort of very simplistic Trump. But here we see a canny individual who is experimenting with different defenses here in the Russia probe, floating a new defense to his relationship with Paul Manafort, which was Joy Reid was also covering tonight, and then saying this about Alan Dershowitz, who is a figure that I think many viewers, of course, know from years of different legal controversies. But he says this. I watched Alan Dershowitz the other day, who, by the way, says this is ridiculous. The Times reporter says, well, he's been very good to you. And Trump goes on, he's been amazing, and he's a liberal Democrat. I don't know him. He's a liberal Democrat. I watched him the other day. He said, number one, there's no collusion. Number two, collusion's not a crime. I want to signal out for the audience and get your analysis on the four key words there that I see that are false. He says, I don't know him. Washington Post reporting just this month that the two men have spoken recently at Mar-a-Lago. Your view about why it's important to the president's legal strategy to invoke Alan Dershowitz as a putatively independent person and then to falsely claim, an easily rebuttable false claim, that he doesn't know him?
Well, he feels the need to get some kind of legitimacy for his argument that there has been no collusion, and even if there was, it wouldn't necessarily be against the law. Now, Alan Dershowitz is not the most reliable person to make that kind of analysis these days. He's been making his living going on Fox News, being a commentator, and kind of being very, very good to Donald Trump, being very one-sided in his analysis and being critiqued constantly by outside legal experts who view this and say, well, actually, it really depends. If there was some kind of conspiracy to collude with the Russians, then that would in fact be a crime. But there was something really...
What about the misleading part? I mean, by the way, he's been a lot on conservative media, but I've invited Professor Dershowitz on our air multiple times and talked to him about the Russia probe. He has a view in all this. Why does the president, in your view, and then David follow on this, say so falsely and so easily provably falsely, I don't know Alan Dershowitz?
Because he wants to maybe distract from the fact that he has been talking to Alan Dershowitz on a regular basis, perhaps. We don't really know how often they've spoken, and make it seem like this is just an outside observer who has no stake in the game.
So a fake third-party validation. David?
Well, there's a part of Donald Trump that is, as you say, canny, and there's a part that is not. If Donald Trump is not going to fire Bob Mueller, then his next strategy is to rev up Republican animosity to Mueller, to make this a tribal badge, to discredit the investigation so that whatever it does find, even if it's harmful, that you've prepared the minds of your supporters to reject whatever the facts are. that means he needs to join that message. I'm not sure that his assurances that he believes Mueller will be fair, I think that may be something where he is talking to himself and patting himself on the back and reassuring himself how great he is and how beloved and how everybody will like him. And it meets that psychic need. As for Alan Dershowitz's legal analysis, look, Alan Dershowitz is a great advocate. If you have committed a serious crime and you're trying to persuade the jury not to convict you, you will do well with Alan Dershowitz. But Alan Dershowitz is not a great constitutional theorist. He's not a great legal analyst. He's a courtroom lawyer. And so when he says things, what he's been saying, it's facially untrue. That when he says things like, well, if the president is acting in the course of his duties, he can't obstruct justice. Well, what if the president gives the order to the National Archivist to burn the National Archives, to cover up his misdeeds? I mean, the National Archivist reports to the President of the United States. Is that in the court? Can he do that? And Alan Dershowitz himself has said, actually, that's an example of something that the president can't do. So I don't think Dershowitz's arguments here are meant to be convincing, but they are profoundly, obviously, reassuring to the president.
Yeah, and on what I think you put well, which is the non-canny side, going back to the ambassador on the foreign policy, and I don't mean to be doing presidential fan fiction and jumping around as much as he does in this interview, but I have such great experts here. I did want to get you more deeply on some of the Asia points you raised, but he talks about this with regard to China, and I'll read the quote. He says, you know, he likes the president. He treated me better than anybody's ever been treated in the history of China. You know that China's hurting us very badly on trade, and I have been soft on China because the only thing more important to me than trade is war. Okay. And it goes to the point David mentions is that's not very canny to blatantly admit that what's most important to him about that very complex foreign policy, socioeconomic, political, military relationship is how he was personally treated.
Indeed, it's quite extraordinary. I think what we see is such grandiosity in this interview. Your point earlier, Ari, when you said that the president said that he could do anything he wanted to with the Justice Department, that sends a signal all over the world that he is an autocrat, just like the autocrats all over the world. In our system, as you pointed out, he cannot do anything he wants to do with the Justice Department anytime he wants to do it. And we are in a world where we've got the rise of autocrats, whether that's Putin up for a re-election in March, which he, of course, is going to win either with 98 or 99% of the vote, because he doesn't need, even though his spokesperson has said we're trying to meddle in his election, he doesn't need us meddling in his election. He's got total control over it. The same is true for a number of leaders around the world, and President Xi has just put himself in the Chinese constitution up with Mao. So this is a guy filled with the grandiosity of what he thinks he can accomplish in the world, when in fact his accomplishments in diplomacy, in peace and security for the United States are not all that much.
Well, I mean, that's heavy. That's a lot of heavy stuff. Natasha, I will go to you on a lighter point. New York Times reporter Josh Dawsey talking about the immediate fallout from this. This is breaking news right now. He says, asked fairly senior Trump advisor for thoughts on NYT interview a few minutes ago. This person responded, what interview? Today?
Right. So it was very clear in this interview that Trump was not surrounded by his aides. This was kind of an impromptu meeting that Mike Schmidt just happened to encounter him while they were having lunch. But I think that just kind of going back to what Ambassador Sherman was saying about the Justice Department for 1 second, I think that Trump made a really astonishing admission in this interview, which is that, you know, he was saying that Mueller, you know, he expected Mueller to treat him fairly, but he also said that all of the controversy over the Russia investigation is really revving up his base. And he said that in particular, congressmen have been coming out to defend him and have been pointing out that this is in fact a witch hunt. And that's a really big indication that Trump himself may not move to fire Mueller because he's expecting his base and certain members of Congress to do the dirty work for him.
I think I'm just going through it. You've got it here. You make a very incisive point, Natasha, and perhaps that's one where we'll take a pause, although, as I mentioned, Joy Reid's coming on, and Lawrence is coming on. It's a party. But I want to read the exact quote in the interest for the viewers understand what you just referenced. Donald Trump says, The Mueller investigation, quote, has really angered the base and made the base stronger. My base is stronger than it's ever been. Some of the congressmen have been unbelievable in pointing out what a witch hunt the whole thing is. So I think it's been proven there is no collusion, as you mentioned. To look through all of this, something that many have compared to a potential Watergate, as only a thing that somehow, like a muscle, makes his core base support stronger, a debatable proposition as is, and an ethically dubious one. An important point, I think, to pause on. Natasha, Bertrand, Wendy Sherman, Ambassador Wendy Sherman, and David Frum, thank you, each of you. I appreciate it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.